Hey Kelly, why did we pick Taipei?
The food.
What's up fam? Welcome back to the Fire Walking Journey channel. This is where I talk about the things that matter to me as a location independent entrepreneur and investor. So I'm back in Miami now, and I was just spending a couple days at the APTA conference and expo. That's the American Public Transportation Association. It's the apparently largest trade expo in the world for public transportation. So it really was awesome. I was there with my co-host of the Urban Files, Chuck Hilston. We were there just to kind of cover and report about the conference, but really we were just there to see all the cool things because we're total transit nerds. And this was like the Comic-Con Consumer Electronics Show, South by Southwest, all rolled into one for city geeks and transit nerds. So if that kind of stuff interests you, we're going to be talking a lot about the conference and the Urban Files channel, so you can check that out. Anyway, it's good to be home. Last week, my video was about our plans for next year to nomad around the continent and then move to Taiwan, to Taipei, Taiwan. And a few people asked, why did you choose Taipei? It's a really, there's a lot to say about it, so I'm going to try to kind of be brief. I'm going to sort of speak very broadly, and definitely I'll be leaving out a lot of details for now. But I do want to sort of cover bigger picture reasoning for our decision to move to Asia and specifically Taipei. Why Asia? There's a few different reasons. When it comes to the kids, we wanted to have them in a Chinese environment so that they can be sort of immersed in that culture. We also wanted to have them start school in one of these top sort of public school environments. So we figured for the kids to get started with the self-discipline and the motivation, at least in the early years. And then they'll have that sort of hard work and self-discipline drive with them, hopefully carrying on as they grow older. And just to clarify that this move to Taipei is just a temporary move. We're thinking we'll be there for 3 or 4 years. It's just so that we can establish our base over there. We also wanted them to have the chance to be immersed in Chinese language, which we considered Cantonese as well as Mandarin, since Mandarin, very, very important, very significant in our view. But then Cantonese also useful because that's my wife's family's language. And then, for us, for my wife and I, because I don't want to overlook that aspect, for us too, as parents, we really have always wanted to have sort of a social and a business base in Asia. We also felt like being closer to family in that part of the world for at least a few years. So this is something that we considered for a really long time, actually, even before we got married. And when my wife was pregnant with our first child, we had many conversations about potentially giving birth in Asia and in Macau specifically. And then even when our child turned 1 year, just after he turned 1 year old, in 2016, we were fully intending to move to Macau. It wasn't really a question of if, but when. What ended up happening was that within a couple months of our return to Florida, my wife got a really great opportunity in Miami. So instead of moving to Macau, which I really think we would have done within the next year or so, instead we moved to Miami. So that was that was what happened, and that kind of delayed this whole move to Asia. But again, it's something that we've thought about for a long time. So, part two, how did we decide on Taipei? As I said, culturally, we wanted to be sort of in a Chinese, I don't know, the diaspora region, whatever, just somewhere that was had a very strong Chinese presence. And so, you know, you've got mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore, really. So on the table then, with those countries in mind, the cities specifically that were most attractive were Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Zhongshan in China. Shanghai and Guangzhou, obviously two of the big four, very livable, very exciting major metropolises. Zhongshan is the oddball there. That's because that's where a lot of my wife's family lives and is from. And so we've spent a lot of time there. And I wouldn't say that we actually strongly considered it, but it was just a useful city to consider for comparison's sake. So Zhongshan, and then Taipei. Well, I'll get into this later, but Taipei really is the star city. So it was really the only one we considered in Taiwan. And then you have Singapore, you have Hong Kong, you have Macau. And in Malaysia, there was Kuala Lumpur, Penang, and Johor Bahru. Right off the bat, China was sort of more or less eliminated. Mainly, we would like to avoid being under the constraints of sort of the Chinese Communist government. And so, you know, Hong Kong, Macau, still to some degree have their own autonomy. Taiwan also. But that said, I will admit that we did waffle a little bit because Shanghai, especially, and Guangzhou are just such awesome cities. And when we spent time there, it's like, maybe we could live here. But again, it's not so much about the cities as it is about just generally being under sort of communist rule. Before I move on from China, though, I do want to say one really attractive thing is that China has tons of affordable sort of mid-sized to large cities. And you know, in the same way that I think about it in the context of the US, you know, you have your New York, San Francisco, LA, but then you have all these other really interesting, very livable mid-tier cities. I don't know, Kansas City, Charlotte, Denver. There are plenty of lesser known cities that can be very nice to live in. China has a lot of those as well. And it makes it interesting to think, where can we find that might be a little bit more affordable? That might be sort of an up and coming, rising kind of city. And there's so many potential ones in China. But again, overall, we're just like, let's steer clear of China. At some point, I would also say that Kuala Lumpur, KL, and Johor Bahru, JB, those were eliminated also by default because I was starting to focus in on one city in each country, and so Penang was the obvious choice because of our family. I have a lot of relatives there. I have sort of familiarity, having been there very, very many times. Kuala Lumpur was in consideration because it has sort of the diversity and the affordability of Malaysia as a whole, but then also has sort of the cosmopolitan feel and the major city amenities that Penang lacks. JB was also a possibility. I don't know it as well. I've been a couple times, but really it was just on the radar as simply being sort of a far-flung suburb of Singapore, and a much more affordable place to live than Singapore. So if we were deciding that we wanted to kind of have our sphere in Singapore, but then we wanted to have the affordability of Malaysia, then JB could make sense. But ultimately, it was best to just move on and just focus on Penang. The final five, which is Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, Penang, and Taipei. Sure, I was distracted a little bit by some other cities that I kind of wanted to put in the mix or compare with, but really it was just always those five, realistically speaking. And in the period of time where we were kind of making this decision, which I would say was about a three 3-year period from 2018 through 2020, there was a good chunk of time where each of those cities was my number one choice, and I felt like, okay, this is the one. This is where we're gonna go live. But yeah, we were factoring in schools. Obviously, that was one of the priorities for us, the public schools. And although, you know, all of our options were more or less really good options. Cost of living, I would say played a large role as well, a very large role. Other things, career opportunities, friends and family, you know, climate, weather, lots of other things that matter to me. Carless infrastructure, arts and culture, different things, you know, quality of life things. But I do want to mention one important thing that also mattered was the immigration possibilities. And while ultimately I felt like I didn't want that to play too much of a role, it still did play in the back of my mind a role, considering how easy it would be to relocate to that country immigration wise, and then what sort of what status we would be living under. Because sure, we could figure out a way to do it, but is it going to be sort of an inconvenient kind of every few months we have to file more paperwork? Or will we be able to live there very comfortably and not have to worry about that immigration piece? And so that comes into play later with Taiwan. And one other thing was my parents. I wanted to know what their thoughts were, because I wanted them to be comfortable with our decision. And so as it turns out, you know, Taipei was really the number one choice for my parents, and that meant a lot. So looking at these ratings, you know, Taipei and Singapore, more or less, I'd say across all, you know, those 2 years of scores that I was rating, Taipei and Singapore were really the two strongest overall. I guess I'll just talk about Taipei now. Really, it's one of the big things that happened was the gold card, which I've talked a lot about on this channel. It became sort of an opportunity for me to solve that immigration puzzle very, very quickly and easily. And not only would it make it such that we could go and live there and our kids could enroll in public schools, but it also gave other benefits. You know, there's benefits as it pertains to health insurance, there's benefits as it pertains to taxes, and there's also benefit in terms of permanent residence. So if we go to Taiwan like we're planning to, and we stay there for 3 years, for more than half of the year, for 3 years, I'll be eligible for permanent residence at the end of that 3rd year. So the immigration piece of the puzzle actually ended up having a positive influence on our decision to move to Taipei. Ultimately though, I would say the city itself was most attractive to us because it had sort of the best balance. So when you look at the pros and cons of Singapore and the pros and cons of Penang, which were really the places we started to hone in on in 2020, the negatives of Penang and the negatives of Singapore were not so bad with Taipei. It had all those positives as well. So it just maybe not as extremely positive as the other places. You know, it's not as extremely affordable as Penang is, but it is pretty affordable. It's also got, you know, the cosmopolitan feel. It's got quite a good international representation. It's got a great mix of city life and nature. So in a lot of ways, it was just a good balance. Hong Kong and Macau, they kind of tapered off by 2020 because of what was going on with the protests with China, and you know, a lot of our friends in Hong Kong weren't so happy living in Hong Kong anymore, and it just felt like maybe the time has passed. I could definitely go on and on with a long video about why we almost wanted to live in Hong Kong, and same with Macau. There's actually a lot of reasons, a lot of positives for those, but ultimately, again, like I'm saying, Taipei just had the best of all worlds, you know, without too many negatives. So anyway, that's why we chose Taipei. There's also a small possibility that when we move to Taipei, we decide to go to a different city in Taiwan after some time because, well, we're not totally opposed to it. Taipei is by far the most expensive city in Taiwan, so if there's somewhere else that's more affordable that we feel like we would enjoy living in, we'll consider that. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time. Peace.